He was a homeless veteran left with nothing but a rusty storage unit and a will. But what he discovered inside would change not just his life, but his understanding of everything he thought was true. If you've ever felt lost or like the world has forgotten you, I need you to listen to this. Stick around, maybe even hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. It's for anyone who's ever needed a second chance. The air in the lawyer's office was thick and warm, smelling of old paper and expensive floor polish. It was the kind of conditioned air that felt unnatural, sealed off from the real world, where exhaust fumes and sidewalk grime were the dominant sense. I sat on a leather chair that probably cost more than every vehicle I'd ever owned combined, and I'd only ever owned two. A rusted-out Ford Ranger I bought for $800 when I was 19, and the dying Chevy Cavalier I was currently sleeping in. The leather was cool against the back of my neck, a stark contrast to the sweat gathering there. I hadn't been this clean in weeks. I'd spent 45 minutes in the washroom of a downtown coffee shop, scrubbing my skin raw with paper towels and hand soap, trying to look like someone who belonged in a place like this. It didn't work. My worn fatigues, the only sturdy pants I own, and the faded hoodie I'd pulled from a Goodwill donation bin, looked like a costume against the backdrop of mahogany bookshelves and framed degrees. The receptionist had looked at me the way people look at a stain on a new carpet, not with hostility exactly, but with a quiet clinical assessment of how to remove me. The woman across the desk, Ms. Pemberton, had a face that was professionally pleasant. It was a mask of polite sympathy that I knew well. I'd seen it on VA administrators who told me my paperwork was lost. I'd seen it on shelter coordinators who told me there were no beds tonight. I'd seen it on the faces of people who were about to tell me there was nothing they could do. She folded her hands on the gleaming surface of the desk. Her nails were perfectly manicured. A thin gold watch caught the light from the window behind her. A small, dry cough escaped her lips before she began. "Mr. Calhoun," she said, her voice as smooth and polished as her desk. "As I mentioned on the phone, I am the executor of your grandfather's estate, Harlan Calhoun." I just nodded. The name felt strange in this room, like a word from a dead language. Harlan, Gramps, the man who smelled like sawdust and pipe tobacco. The man who was a ghost in my memories, a faded photograph in a life I barely recalled. He'd been gone from my world for over 20 years, a silent, unexplained absence that had left a hole I'd long since learned to navigate around. You don't fill a hole like that, you just learn to walk along its edge without falling in. "He passed away 3 months ago," she had said on the phone 2 days earlier. Her voice had been careful, measured the way you deliver news to a stranger about another stranger. I hadn't felt much then, just a dull, distant thud, like a door closing in a house down the street. How do you grieve someone you already buried in your mind a long time ago? How do you mourn a ghost? "Your grandfather's affairs were modest." She continued, choosing her words with care, the way a surgeon chooses an incision point. "He did not leave behind a great deal of monetary wealth. There is no property in the traditional sense, no stocks, no bonds, no retirement accounts." She paused, and I recognized the pause. It was the pause people use when they're letting bad news settle, giving it room to breathe before they pile on more. I'd heard that pause in a field hospital in Kandahar when a medic was about to tell a soldier the leg was gone. I'd heard it in VA offices when a caseworker was about to tell me I didn't qualify for a program that could have changed my life. It didn't bother me. I wasn't expecting anything. The fact that Harlan Calhoun had a will at all was a surprise. The fact that he'd remembered my name was a bigger one. That was the first thing that cracked the wall. 20 years of silence. 20 years of nothing. No birthday card. No phone call. No letter slipped under a door. And now from the grave, he speaks my name. He puts it in a legal document in black ink, witnessed and notarized. Silas Calhoun. As if I still mattered. As if I had ever mattered to him at all. "However," Miss Pemberton said, her tone shifting slightly, like a car changing gears on a hill, "he was very specific about one item, an inheritance he wanted to ensure passed directly and only to you." She slid a single large, old-fashioned key across the desk. It scraped against the polished wood with a sound like a whisper. The key was heavy, made of tarnished brass, the kind of key you see in old movies, the kind that opens a chest in a pirate story or a door in a fairy tale. It didn't belong in this modern office with its fluorescent lights and its filtered air. It belonged to another era. Attached to it was a faded plastic tag. The number 217 was written on it in permanent marker, the ink slightly smeared as if a thumb had brushed across it before it dried. Alongside the key, she placed a thick cream-colored envelope. My name was written on the front in a shaky but deliberate script that I vaguely recognized. The letters were formed with effort, the hand behind them unsteady but determined. Silas, just my first name. No last name needed, as if the writer knew there was only one Silas who would ever hold this envelope. He left you the contents of a storage unit, Ms. Pemberton explained. Unit 217 at North Fork Storage, just outside of a town called Pine Hollow. It's about a 4-hour drive from here. Or there's a bus that runs twice a day. She glanced at my clothes and made her calculation. The lease on the unit is paid in full for the next 6 months. After that, it becomes your responsibility. I stared at the key, a storage unit, a metal box in some forgotten town I'd never heard of. That was my inheritance. Not a house, not a savings account, not even a watch or a ring, the kinds of things grandfathers leave behind in the movies. A storage unit, a box full of someone else's junk. I could already picture it. Yellowed newspapers stacked to the ceiling. A broken rocking chair with a missing leg. Boxes of clothes reeking of mothballs and mildew. Maybe some old tools rusted beyond use. The accumulated debris of a life lived small and ended quietly. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a final chore. A burden from a man who had already burdened me with his absence. One last thing to deal with, one last mess to clean up, left behind by someone who couldn't be bothered to stick around and clean up the biggest mess of all. Me. That's it, I asked. My voice was rougher than I intended. It came out like gravel scraping against concrete. I hadn't spoken much in days. When you live in your car, conversations become rare. You talk to gas station cashiers. You talk to day labor dispatchers. You talk to yourself sometimes in the dark just to make sure your voice still works. Ms. Pemberton's professional smile flickered for just a fraction of a second, like a candle in a draft. She recovered quickly. They always do. That is the entirety of the tangible estate, she said. There is also this letter. He instructed that you be given it at the same time as the key. He was quite adamant about that. Both together or neither at all. She nudged the cream-colored envelope an inch closer to me with her fingertip as if she were sliding a card across a poker table. Now there is one small complication you should be aware of. The land the storage facility sits on was recently sold to a development corporation, Pinnacle Development Group. They have plans for a resort and residential community. All leaseholders were given a notice of termination. Your grandfather's prepaid term will be honored, but at the end of the 6 months, the facility will be demolished. You will need to have the unit cleared by then. 6 months. It sounded like a lifetime and no time at all. 6 months ago, I had a spot under a bridge that I shared with 2 other veterans. 6 months before that, I'd had a room in a transitional shelter that closed due to lack of funding. Time didn't move the way it used to. It lurched and stumbled, like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. I picked up the key. It was cold and heavy in my palm. Its teeth were sharp against my skin, biting into the soft flesh at the base of my fingers. It felt real in a way that nothing in my life had felt real in a long time. It was solid. It was tangible. It was an anchor to a past I didn't want dropped into the current of a future I couldn't see. Okay, I said. The word felt hollow, like a stone dropped into an empty well. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Calhoun, Ms. Pemberton said. The sympathy in her voice sounded a little more genuine this time. Maybe she finally saw past the worn clothes to the exhaustion underneath. Maybe she saw the tremor in my hand as I closed my fingers around the key. Maybe she noticed the way my jaw tightened when I looked at the envelope at those shaky letters spelling out a name I hadn't felt anyone care about in 20 years. Or maybe she was just good at her job. I walked out of that air-conditioned tomb and back into the humid chaos of the city. The sun was blinding after the dim controlled light of the office. The noise of traffic hit me like a wall. Horns, engines, the hiss of bus brakes, a jackhammer somewhere in the distance tearing up concrete. The city didn't care that my world had just shifted a few degrees on its axis. The city never cares. I stood on the sidewalk, clutching the envelope in one hand and the key in the other. My grandfather's handwriting stared up at me from the cream-colored paper, a strange alien script against my skin. For 20 years, he had been a question mark, a ghost, a silence where a voice should have been. Now he was a brass key to a metal box in a town I'd never heard of and a letter I was afraid to read. I leaned against the brick wall of the building, the rough surface digging into my back through my thin hoodie. The heat of the bricks radiated into my spine. I had $43 to my name, a half tank of waste in a car that might not start tomorrow, and a key to a past I had tried so hard to outrun. My plan for the day had been simple. The plan was always simple. Find a place to park for the night where I wouldn't get a knock on the window from a cop at 3 a.m. Try to find a day labor gig in the morning. Loading trucks, clearing debris, anything that paid cash at the end of the shift. Eat something. Survive. Repeat. Now I had a destination. Pine Hollow. A place that existed on no map in my mind, a name attached to nothing but a dead man's final wishes. I looked at the envelope one more time. I almost opened it right there, standing on that busy sidewalk with strangers streaming past me, like water around a stone. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the strange, irrational feeling that once I read those words, I could never unread them. That whatever was inside that envelope would change something fundamental, would rearrange the furniture of my mind in ways I couldn't predict. I slid the envelope into the inside pocket of my jacket. I could feel its sharp corners against my ribs. A small, stiff rectangle pressing against my heart. Then I walked to the bus station. The bus ride to Pine Hollow was a journey through a landscape of forgotten things. We left the city behind within the first hour, the skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just a smudge of gray against the sky. Then came the suburbs, the strip malls, the chain restaurants, all the same, all interchangeable. And then as the highway narrowed and the exits grew farther apart, the landscape began to change. We passed shuttered factories with broken windows that stared out like vacant eyes. We passed small towns where the main streets were lined with more for lease signs than open businesses. Gas stations with sun-bleached prices on their signs. Churches with peeling paint. Houses with porches that sagged in the middle, as if the weight of living in them had become too much to bear. It was a part of the country that felt tired, worn down at the edges like a piece of fabric that had been washed too many times. The color was fading, the threads were coming loose, and I felt a grim kinship with it. I knew what it felt like to be used up and set aside, to be a place that people drove through on their way to somewhere better. I sat with my forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the world blur by in a smear of green and gray. The bus smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee and the faint sweet scent of someone's fast food long since eaten. The air conditioning hummed a constant low note like a machine pretending to breathe. A baby cried a few rows back, a thin, reedy sound that seemed to needle its way directly into my skull. Not because it was annoying, but because it was so raw, so honest. That baby didn't know how to pretend it wasn't hurting. It hadn't learned yet. That's a skill you pick up later, the ability to sit with your pain in silence, to swallow it down and keep your face still. I'd gotten very good at it. The letter sat in the inside pocket of my jacket. Every time I moved, I could feel its sharp corners digging into my ribs, a constant physical reminder. It was like carrying a grenade with the pin still in, safe for now. But the potential for detonation was always there, always pressing against me. I was afraid of what it might say. Would it be an apology? A few thin sentences of regret, the kind of words people write when they know it's too late for the words to matter. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I wish things had been different. The kind of hollow sentiments you find in greeting cards, mass-produced and meaningless. Or would it be an explanation? A story I hadn't heard, a reason I couldn't imagine. And if it was, did I even want to hear it? Did I want to know why he left if the reason might make it hurt more? Part of me, the hard, calcified part that had kept me alive on the streets and in the mountains of Afghanistan, wanted to rip the envelope to shreds, to tear it into confetti and let the pieces scatter from the bus window, white flakes falling onto the gray highway like the saddest snow you ever saw. To sever this last tenuous connection to a man who had been a phantom for most of my life. But I couldn't. Loyalty, maybe, or maybe just a desperate, foolish curiosity, the same curiosity that made me enlist, that made me volunteer for patrols that no one else wanted, that made me look into dark rooms when every instinct said to stay back. The need to know even when knowing might destroy you. My memories of my grandfather were fractured like pieces of a mirror that had been dropped and scattered across a floor. Each piece reflected something, but none of them gave you the whole picture. I remembered the smell. That was the strongest one. Sawdust and pipe tobacco mixed together into a scent that was uniquely his. His workshop was a small, detached building behind a house I could barely picture anymore. The walls were lined with tools, each one hanging in its designated place, the outline of each tool drawn on the pegboard behind it in pencil. Even as a small boy, I understood that this was a man who believed everything had a place, everything had a purpose. I remembered the rough, calloused feel of his hand holding mine as we walked along a river. I must have been 5 or 6. The river was wide and slow, the water the color of tea, and the bank was littered with flat, smooth stones perfect for skipping. He taught me how to do it. His voice was a low rumble, the kind of voice that seemed to come from deep inside his chest, like it had to travel a long way before it reached the air. You got to get it low, Silas. Let it kiss the water. Don't punch it. Let it kiss. I remembered throwing the stone wrong, watching it plunk straight into the river with a single disappointing splash. And I remembered him laughing, not at me, never at me. A deep, hearty sound that made his whole body shake, that made the birds in the trees go quiet for a moment, as if they were listening too. And then he'd put another stone in my hand, and we'd try again. I remembered sitting on his lap in the workshop, watching his hands move a block plane across a piece of wood. The thin, curling shavings would fall to the floor like ribbons, and I would collect them, pressing them into my palm, marveling at how something so rough could be made so smooth. I remembered him being strong, not in the way that soldiers are strong, not in the way that implies violence or threat, strong in the way that old trees are strong, rooted, steady, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice because his presence was enough. And then I remembered him being gone. I was 8 years old. It was a Tuesday night, I think, though I'm not certain. What I am certain of is the sound, my parents' voices, sharp and angry, coming through my bedroom door like knives through paper. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. The tone was enough. It was the tone of something breaking. And then his voice, my grandfather's. Quieter than my parents, but thick with a pain I was too young to understand. It was the sound of a man trying to hold something together while it crumbled in his hands. The next morning he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation, no last hug, no last stone skipped across the river. Just an empty chair at the breakfast table and a silence where his voice used to be. My mother said he'd moved away, that he needed to be on his own. She said it the way you'd say the weather was changing, like it was inevitable and out of anyone's control. My father said nothing. His silence was a wall I could never climb, no matter how many times I tried. I stopped asking about Harlan Calhoun after a while. Children learn quickly which questions make the adults around them uncomfortable, which questions make their mother's eyes go hard and their father's hands grip the edge of the table. You learn to stop asking. You learn to let the ghost be a ghost. A few years later, my parents were gone too. A wreck on a rain-slicked highway, 2 lanes, no guardrails, a curve taken too fast on a November night. I was 10. The police officer who came to the school to tell me had the same look on his face that Miss Pemberton had in her office. Professional sympathy, the kind that says, "I'm sorry for your loss," but really means I'll be moving on from this in an hour and you'll be carrying it forever. After that, it was a blur. Foster homes and group homes and institutions, each one a different shade of the same gray. A slow, grinding erosion of who I was, of who I might have been. The system doesn't raise you. It processes you. It moves you along a conveyor belt of temporary beds and temporary families and temporary concern. And when you reach the end, when you age out at 18, it spits you out onto the sidewalk and wishes you luck. The army seemed like the only logical escape. Not because I was patriotic, not because I believed in a cause, because the army was a door and I needed a door. Any door. When you've spent your whole childhood being shuffled between other people's houses, the idea of a place where you belong, where you have a bunk with your name on it, in a unit that claims you as its own is intoxicating. It wasn't an escape. It was just a different kind of cage, but one with structure, rules. A reason to wake up at 5 a.m. that didn't involve searching for a breakfast you weren't sure you'd find. I was good at it too. Good at following orders. Good at staying quiet. Good at enduring discomfort. Those were all skills I'd learned long before basic training. The foster system was its own kind of boot camp. 2 tours in Afghanistan. I don't like to talk about what happened there. Not because I can't, but because the words I have are too small for what I saw. Language breaks down at a certain altitude of experience. What I will say is this: the service broke something in me. Not my body, not in any way a doctor could point to on an x-ray or measure with a blood test. Something deeper, something structural. It chipped away at the load-bearing walls of my soul, leaving me standing, but unstable, a building that looks fine from the outside but creaks in the wind. I came home with a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that lived in my chest like a second heartbeat, a profound sense of dislocation of being a stranger in my own country. The world had kept spinning while I was gone, and I couldn't find the groove to jump back onto the record. Everyone else was dancing to a song I couldn't hear. The VA was a bureaucratic nightmare of paperwork, in waiting lists, in phone calls that went nowhere. The transitional programs were band-aids on a bullet wound, temporary fixes for permanent damage, a bed for 90 days, a counselor for 6 sessions, a job placement program that placed me in a warehouse that laid me off after 3 months. Soon enough, my car became my home, a rolling metal shell that held the few possessions I had left. A duffel bag, a sleeping bag, a photograph of my parents that I kept in the glove compartment, and now apparently a brass key to a storage unit in Pine Hollow. The bus wheezed to a stop, the air brakes hissing like something angry and tired. The hydraulics groaned as the door folded open, letting in a rush of warm, clean air that smelled of pine and cut grass and something else. Distance, open space, the absence of concrete. Pine Hollow, the driver announced, his voice tinny over the intercom, as if the town's name was just another word, no more important than any other stop on the route. I grabbed my worn duffel bag from the overhead rack and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. The light was different here, softer than the city's, less aggressive. It fell on the buildings and the trees and the cracked sidewalks with a kind of gentleness, as if it had nowhere else to be. The town was small, smaller than I had imagined, and I hadn't imagined much. A single main street lined with old brick buildings, their facades faded by decades of sun and snow. A diner with a hand-painted sign that said Nadine's, in letters that were once red and were now a sun-bleached pink. A hardware store with a window display of tools and garden supplies that looked like it hadn't been updated since 1987. A post office. A bar called the Cornerstone, its neon sign dark in the daylight. It was quiet, eerily quiet after the constant roar of the city. No jackhammers, no sirens, no honking. Just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere behind the main street. There was a stillness in the air, a sense of a place holding its breath, a town waiting for something, though it had probably forgotten what. A few people on the sidewalk glanced at me as I walked. An old man in overalls sitting on a bench outside the hardware store. A woman pushing a stroller. A teenager on a bicycle. They looked at me the way small-town people look at strangers, not with hostility, but with a quiet alertness, the way a deer looks at a noise in the woods, noting my presence, filing it away. North Fork Storage was about a mile out of town, according to the gas station attendant who sold me a bottle of water. He was a young guy with a sunburned neck and a name tag that said Dale. He gave me directions without asking why I needed them, which I appreciated. I walked. My duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the strap digging into the same groove it had worn into my collarbone over the years. The asphalt was hot through the worn soles of my boots, each step a reminder that I needed new ones. The road out of town was lined with pine trees and overgrown ditches, and the air smelled of warm earth and resin. The facility was exactly what I had pictured. A collection of long, low metal buildings, their corrugated steel walls painted a faded, rust-streaked red that had probably been cheerful once decades ago. Now it looked like dried blood. A chain-link fence topped with 3 strands of barbed wire surrounded the property, though the barbed wire was sagging and rusted in most places, more symbolic than functional. The gate was open. A keypad mounted on a post next to it was covered in dust and cobwebs, its digital display dead. There was no one in the small office building near the entrance. The door was locked. A piece of paper was taped to the glass, its edges curling in the heat. Find your unit. Your code is your unit number. Office hours by appointment only. Be out by 9 p.m. The air inside the fence was hot and still trapped between the metal walls of the storage buildings like heat in an oven. The rows of identical red doors stretched out before me, each one the same as the last, a grid of sealed secrets. Numbers painted in white on each door, some crisp, some faded to ghosts of themselves. 200. I walked down the lane between 2 rows of units, my footsteps echoing off the corrugated steel. The sound was hollow and flat, the sound of a place that absorbed noise without giving anything back. The silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant caw of a crow sitting on the barbed wire fence like a small, dark sentinel. It felt like a graveyard, not for people but for things, for the pieces of lives that people couldn't quite bring themselves to throw away, but couldn't bear to keep close. The furniture from a marriage that ended, the toys from a childhood that passed, the tools from a career that was over. All of it sealed behind metal doors, waiting in the dark for someone to come back. Most of them never do. 217. I found it. Unit 217. The door was the same faded red as the others, but the rust seemed thicker here, creeping up from the bottom edge, like a slow disease eating into the metal in jagged orange patches. The hasp was thick with oxidation, and the padlock hanging from it was a solid pitted lump of metal that looked like it had been there since the facility was built. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It was warm from my body heat, now the tarnish dark against my skin. I looked at it, then looked at the padlock. The padlock was a modern master lock, circular, with a small keyhole meant for a flat modern key. The key in my hand was an old skeleton key, ornate and oversized, meant for a lock from another century. They didn't match. My heart sank, a slow, heavy drop like a stone falling through water. Of course. Of course it didn't work. A final cruel joke from a man who had already dealt me the cruelest one of all. An inheritance that led nowhere. A key that opened nothing. A 4-hour bus ride to a dead-end town for a dead man's punchline. I felt the familiar bitter taste of disappointment flood my mouth. The taste I knew better than any other. The taste of promises that evaporated, of programs that ended, of doors that looked open from a distance but were locked when you reached them. I was about to turn away. I was about to shove the useless key back into my pocket, shoulder my duffel bag, and walk back to the bus station. Back to the city, back to the life I knew, a hard life, a lonely life, but a predictable one. One where I didn't expect anything and therefore was never surprised when I got nothing. But then my eyes caught something. A small metallic rectangle tucked up under the overhanging lip of the roof just above the doorframe. It was a magnetic lockbox, the kind people attach to the underside of their car to hide a spare key. It was coated in a thick layer of grime and dust, almost perfectly camouflaged against the dirty metal of the building. You'd never see it unless you were looking for it, unless you were standing right here at exactly this angle with the late afternoon sun hitting the door just right. He had planned this. He had known that the brass key wouldn't fit the padlock, and he had accounted for it. This wasn't carelessness. This was design. A two-step system, deliberate and careful, the way a man who drew blueprints and hung tools in outlined spaces would do it. The brass key was for something else. Something inside, maybe. And the real key to the door was here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the one person who would stand in this spot and need it. My fingers fumbled as I reached up and pulled the box down. Dust rained onto my face, into my eyes. I blinked it away. The box was small, the size of a deck of cards, its magnetic surface still strong enough to resist my pull. I pried it open. The hinge was stiff with age. Inside, nestled on a small piece of foam, was a single silver key, a key for the padlock. The lock was stiff. 20 years of weather and neglect had fused the mechanism into something that felt more like stone than steel. I had to put my whole body into it, planting my feet, gripping the lock with both hands, grunting with effort as I tried to turn the key. The muscles in my forearms stood out like cables. Sweat ran down my temples. I was about to give up when it finally broke free. A loud, sharp crack like a bone snapping. The sound was unnaturally loud in the dead silence of the storage yard, echoing off the metal walls and fading into the still air. The bolt slid back with a grinding reluctance, metal scraping against metal, the sound of something that had been sealed for a very long time, agreeing finally to open. I took a deep breath. My hand rested on the cold, ridged handle of the roll-up door. The metal was rough under my palm, pockmarked with rust, warm on the surface from the sun, but cold underneath. I braced myself for the smell of decay, for the sight of worthless junk, for the final confirmation that Harlan Calhoun had left me nothing but a mess to clean up. Then, with a groan of protesting metal that sounded almost human, I heaved the door upward. The darkness inside was absolute for a moment. A solid wall of black, as if the unit contained not objects, but the absence of light itself. And then my eyes began to adjust the blackness, dissolving into shapes, into shadows, into outlines that slowly gained depth and definition. The air that rolled out was not the smell of rot I had expected. It was dry and cool, a pocket of preserved atmosphere that had been sealed away from the seasons. And it smelled of something that stopped me in my tracks. Old wood, canvas, machine oil, and underneath all of it, threading through everything like a melody through silent sawdust. A wave of dizziness washed over me. My hand gripped the door frame to keep myself upright. It was the smell of his workshop, the smell of Saturday mornings when I was 5 years old, sitting on his lap watching the wood shavings curl and fall, the smell of safety, the smell of the last place in my childhood where I had felt completely, unreservedly loved. The unit was packed, but it wasn't chaotic. It was organized with a precision that bordered on reverence, a carefully constructed puzzle of a life. Every object had been placed with intention, every space used with purpose. This was not a man throwing his possessions into a box before walking away. This was a man building an archive. Against the back wall, a large wooden workbench stood, its surface scarred and stained with the marks of countless projects. Gouges from chisels, rings from coffee mugs, pencil lines that had never been sanded away. It was a topography of labor, a map of every cut and joint and measurement that had been worked out on its surface. Above the workbench, a pegboard covered the wall, and from it hung tools. Hand saws with wooden handles darkened by decades of grip. Chisels of varying widths, their steel edges still catching what little light reached the back of the unit. Block planes, coping saws, a brace and bit, files, and rasps. Each tool hung in its designated spot, and behind each one, drawn in pencil on the pegboard, was its outline. Everything in its place, even in exile, even in a metal box in a forgotten storage yard. Stacks of canvas tarps covered large bulky shapes along one wall. A heavy wooden chest sat against the other wall, bound with iron straps, the wood dark with age. Its lid was flat and solid, the iron straps bolted through with square-headed bolts that looked hand-forged. It was the kind of chest you'd expect to find in the hold of an old ship built to survive storms. Neatly labeled cardboard boxes were stacked almost to the ceiling. The handwriting on the labels was the same shaky but deliberate script I'd seen on the envelope. Kitchen, books, winter clothes, and then one that made my breath stop. Silas, aged 6 to 8. I stood there for a long moment staring at those words. My name in his handwriting on a box that he had packed and labeled and kept for 20 years. A box he had carried from wherever he'd been through however many moves and however many lonely rooms, and placed here in this unit with the same care that he'd placed his best chisels on the pegboard. I walked over to it. My hands were unsteady. I pulled the box down from the stack, and dust motes erupted into the single beam of sunlight that pierced the gloom from the open door. They swirled and danced in the golden light like tiny, weightless ghosts. I pried open the cardboard flaps. Inside, nestled in yellow tissue paper, were things I hadn't seen in 20 years. Things I had forgotten existed. Things I had forgotten I had ever owned. A small, hand-carved wooden soldier, its paint chipped and faded, but its form still perfect. He had carved it for me. I remembered now. He had made it in his workshop while I watched the knife moving in small, precise strokes, the wood slowly taking shape. A collection of smooth, flat stones, river stones, skipping stones. I picked one up, and it fit perfectly in the curve between my thumb and forefinger, as if my hand had been made to hold it, or as if it had been chosen 20 years ago by a man who knew exactly how big my hand would grow. A tattered copy of Where the Wild Things Are, the cover held together with tape, the pages soft with use. He used to read it to me. I could hear his voice low and rumbly, giving each wild thing its own growl. In a photograph. It was a 4x6 print, its colors slightly faded, its edges soft with handling. It was a picture of me and him sitting on the wooden steps of his workshop. I was a little kid, maybe 6 years old, with a gap-toothed grin and a smear of sawdust on my cheek. My hand was resting on his knee, and he was looking at me. Not at the camera, at me, and the expression on his face was one of pure, unguarded, unapologetic love. The kind of love that doesn't perform for an audience. The kind of love that exists whether anyone is watching or not. A raw, painful lump formed in my throat. The kind that sits right at the base, right where swallowing happens, and refuses to move. My eyes burned, the photograph blurred. This wasn't the junk of a man who had forgotten me. This wasn't the careless debris of a life that had moved on. This was the archive of a man who had remembered everything, every stone, every tie, every bedtime story. He had carried my childhood with him wherever he had gone for 20 years. He had kept the pieces of me safe even when he couldn't keep me. I set the photograph carefully on the workbench. My hands were shaking. I wiped my eyes with the back of my wrist and looked around the unit again, seeing it differently now. Not as a storage unit, as a cathedral. A small metal cathedral built by a man who had nothing left but his memories and his tools. It was then that I saw it. Sitting on the workbench, placed deliberately in the center, exactly where your eyes would go if you were standing in the doorway looking in. It hadn't been left there accidentally. It had been positioned, staged almost, as if the man who put it there had stood in the doorway, checked the sight line, and adjusted its placement until it was perfect. It was a small olive drab metal box. An old military ammo can, the kind the Army uses to store .50 caliber rounds. The paint was scratched and dented, the surface marred by years of use. But on the top, painted in careful white letters, neat and square and deliberate, was a single word. Silas. My hands were trembling as I reached for it. The metal was cool under my fingers, the surface slightly rough with age. The latches on the front were stiff, the springs inside them weakened by time, but they still worked. I pressed them with my thumbs, and they popped open with a satisfying metallic clink one after the other. Left, right. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no money, no jewelry, no object of any monetary value that a pawn shop would give me $20 for. There was only a thick stack of envelopes bound together with a simple piece of rough twine. They were the same cream color as the one in my jacket pocket. Dozens of them, maybe 100. And on the top one, in the same shaky, deliberate handwriting, poor words. Read this one first. I sat down on the edge of the iron-bound chest. The cold metal seeped through my jeans, pressing against my thighs. The single beam of sunlight from the open doorway cut through the dusty air like a spotlight illuminating the ammo can on my lap, the stack of letters inside it, and my own trembling hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped rhythm, the heartbeat of a man standing on the edge of something he can't see the bottom of. I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket, the one Miss Pemberton had given me in the office. It was warm from my body heat, from the hours it had spent pressed against my chest, absorbing my warmth, my heartbeat, the rhythm of my breathing. I compared it to the one on top of the stack. They were identical. Same paper, same envelope, same handwriting. Two letters separated by time and circumstance, but written by the same hand. The light was fading. The beam of sunlight had shifted, moving slowly across the concrete floor as the afternoon wore on. The shadows inside the unit were deepening, the corners dissolving into darkness. I took a deep, shuddering breath. And then, with fingers that felt like they belonged to someone else, I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope and broke the seal. The paper inside was thick and soft, the kind of paper you buy at a stationery store, not the kind you pull from a printer. I unfolded it slowly, carefully, as if it might crumble at my touch. The creases were sharp, the folds precise. And there, in the quiet, fading light of a storage unit in a town I'd never heard of, surrounded by the tools and memories and carefully preserved fragments of a life I thought had abandoned me, I began to read my grandfather's words. "My dearest Sila," the letter began, and nothing was ever the same again. "My dearest Silas," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then it means I am gone. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for so many things, more than these pages can hold, more than any number of pages could hold. A man's regrets, when they have had 20 years to grow, become something enormous, something that fills every room he enters, every silence he sits in." I read those first lines 3 times. The handwriting was shaky, the letters trembling at their edges, but the words themselves were steady, deliberate, chosen with the care of a man who had spent a long time deciding exactly what to say. "I know you must have questions. I know you must be angry. I know you might hate me. I wouldn't blame you if you did. You have every right. I have imagined your anger many times lying awake in the dark, and I have accepted it the way a man accepts the weather. It comes. You endure it. You don't pretend it isn't there." He was right about the anger. It was there, coiled in my chest like a fist, the same fist that had been clenched for 20 years. The anger was old and familiar, worn smooth by time, like one of those river stones in the box. I had carried it so long it had become part of my anatomy, a phantom organ that pulsed with its own dark rhythm. But there was something else now, too. Something I hadn't expected. A crack in the wall, a thin line of light where there had been only darkness. Because the man who wrote these words didn't sound like a man who had walked away without looking back. He sounded like a man who had been looking back every single day. "The story you were told, that I just left, that I abandoned you and your parents because I wanted to be alone, it is not the truth, Silas. It is the story I needed you to believe. It was the only story that would keep you safe. I stopped reading. I read that line again, and again, the words rearranged themselves in my mind, shifting and clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. Keep you safe. The phrase didn't make sense. It was a contradiction, an impossibility. How does a man keep a child safe by leaving him? How does absence equal protection? He was the one who disappeared, the one who left me to navigate the wreckage of a family that fell apart. He was the one who let me grow up believing I wasn't worth staying for. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, shot through my chest. This was a coward's excuse. A beautiful, well-written, carefully composed coward's excuse. A way to rewrite history from the grave where no one could challenge him, where no one could say, "That's not what happened, old man. What happened is you left." I almost crumpled the paper in my fist. My fingers tightened on the edges, the thick stationery bending under my grip. One more ounce of pressure, and it would fold, crack, become unreadable. One motion, and I could destroy this letter and walk out of this unit and never think about Harlan Calhoun again. But something held my hand, something deeper than the anger. Maybe it was the photograph, the one of the two of us on the workshop steps, his eyes on me with that look of undisguised love. Maybe it was the box of river stones and wooden soldiers that he'd carried for 2 decades. Maybe it was the smell of sawdust that still hung in the air around me like a benediction. A man who keeps your childhood in a box for 20 years is not a man who left because he didn't care. I loosened my grip on the letter. I smoothed the creases with my thumb, and I kept reading. Your father, my son Garrett, was a good man at his core. I need you to know that. Whatever else I tell you in this letter, I need you to hold on to that. He loved you. He loved your mother. But he was broken in a way that love alone couldn't fix. My father, Garrett Calhoun. I had so few memories of him that they felt more like photographs than experiences. A tall man with dark hair and tired eyes. Hands that were always moving, tapping the table, drumming on the steering wheel, fidgeting with a coin that he rolled across his knuckles. A man who seemed to be vibrating at a frequency slightly higher than everyone around him, like a string pulled too tight. Your father was a gambler, Silas, not the kind who goes to Las Vegas once a year and loses $100 at the blackjack table. The real kind. The kind that is a sickness, a hunger that lives in the blood and never goes away, no matter how many times you swear it will. He gambled on cards, on horses, on football games, on anything that offered the possibility of a win. And when he won, it was never enough. And when he lost, he borrowed to cover the loss. And when the borrowing ran out from the banks and the friends and the family, he went to the only people who would still lend to a man like him. A cold feeling began to spread through my stomach. Not the heat of anger, but something colder. Something that moved slowly like ice, forming on still water. He borrowed money from men who did not deal in interest rates in payment plans. Silas. Men who dealt in fear. Men whose names you didn't say out loud. Men who operated in the spaces between what was legal and what was real, and who enforced their agreements not with lawyers, but with violence. I set the letter down on my knee. My hands were shaking. The single beam of light from the doorway had narrowed to a thin golden line on the concrete floor. The shadows in the unit were growing longer, deeper, pressing in from the corners like something alive. I picked the letter back up. I tried to help him. I gave him every cent I had. I sold my truck, my best tools, things I had spent a lifetime collecting. I gave him the money and I told him to pay these men off and never go near them again. He promised he would. He swore it on your name. I could hear Harlan's voice in the words now. Low and rumbling, the way I remembered it from the river, but sadder, heavier. The voice of a man carrying a weight he never set down. It wasn't enough. The debts had grown too large, the interest too steep. He paid some of it, but he couldn't stop gambling. He took the money I gave him, and he tried to double it at the track. He lost. And the men he owed were not the kind who accepted apologies. They were not the kind who gave extensions or reduced balances or agreed to payment plans. They were the kind who sent messages. The cold in my stomach spread upward into my chest, wrapping itself around my ribs. The messages weren't directed at your father. Not at first. These men were smarter than that. They knew that a gambler has already demonstrated his willingness to sacrifice his own well-being. Threatening him directly would have been ineffective. So they threatened the things he loved. They threatened you. I stopped breathing. One evening, a car followed your mother and you home from the grocery store. A dark sedan with tinted windows. It pulled up across the street from your house and just sat there, engine running, headlights off. It sat there for 2 hours. Your mother saw it from the kitchen window. She called your father. He knew exactly what it meant. I tried to summon a memory, a car, a dark car, my mother at the window. But I was 5, maybe 6. The memories of that age are not scenes, they are impressions. Feelings without pictures. I remembered my mother being afraid. I remembered her checking the locks on the doors more than once. I remembered a feeling of unease in the house, a tension that vibrated in the walls like a low, inaudible hum. Another time, the tires on your mother's car were slashed. All 4 of them in the driveway in the middle of the night. Your father found them in the morning and told her it was probably teenagers, vandals, a random act. But he knew. And I knew because he came to me the next day shaking, barely able to speak. The letter continued, and with each paragraph, the foundation of my life shifted a few more degrees. The story I had lived inside the narrative I had constructed from the fragments I was given was crumbling like a wall made of dry sand. I realized that as long as I was in the picture, as long as your father had someone to fall back on, a safety net, these men would continue to use that connection as leverage. They knew he would do anything to protect you and your mother. They knew I would do anything to protect all 3 of you. We were pressure points, Silas, and they were squeezing. I could feel the architecture of the letter now. It was building towards something. Each paragraph was a step carefully laid, leading me down a path I didn't want to walk but couldn't leave. So I made the hardest decision of my life, the decision that broke me, the decision I have lived with every single day since and will carry with me into whatever comes after this life. I left. 2 words, a period after each one, the shortest sentence in the letter and the heaviest. I went to those men. I went alone without telling, your father, and I made them a deal. I would assume every dollar of Garrett's debt, every last dime. I would pay it off however long it took with my own labor, my own hands. In exchange, they would leave Garrett alone. They would leave your mother alone. They would leave you alone. The condition was that I had to disappear. Completely. No contact with your father. No contact with you. No phone calls. No letters. No visits. If I ever reached out, if I was ever seen near your family again, the deal was void and the original threats would resume. I had to become a ghost. The word ghost echoed in my mind. It was the same word I had used to describe him for 20 years. A ghost. An absence. A silence. But I had always used it with bitterness, with contempt, the way you describe someone who chose to vanish. Now the word took on a different shape. Not a man who chose to disappear, but a man who was forced to. A man who made himself invisible so that the people who wanted to hurt his family would look away. I told your father I was leaving for good. I told him I was disgusted with him. I said things to him that I will not repeat in this letter, things that were designed to wound, to cut so deep that he would never come looking for me. I made him believe that I hated him, that I was ashamed of him, that I wanted nothing to do with him or his family ever again. I had to become the villain in your story, Silas, so that you could have a story at all. I dropped the letter. It didn't flutter. It fell straight down the heavy paper, barely catching the air, landing face up on the concrete floor between my boots. The words stared up at me from the ground. My grandfather's handwriting shaking and careful, looking up at me like a face. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were encased in concrete, wrapped in something hard and unyielding that wouldn't expand no matter how much my body demanded air. The unit seemed to contract around me, the metal walls leaning in the ceiling, pressing down. The smell of sawdust, which moments ago had been a comfort, now felt overwhelming, suffocating the scent of a world that had been rearranged without my knowledge or consent. The entire foundation of my life, the central defining narrative of my childhood, the story of my abandonment was a lie. Not a small lie, not a lie of omission, not a half-truth, or a well-intentioned distortion. A complete, deliberate, structural lie. The kind of lie you build a life on top of the way you build a house on a foundation, trusting it to hold. And now the foundation was gone, dissolved, and everything I had built on top of it, every conclusion I had drawn, every decision I had made every night, I had lain awake in the back of my car, telling myself that I was alone, because I had always been alone, because the people who were supposed to love me had chosen not to. All of it was suspended in midair, unsupported, waiting to fall. He hadn't left me. He had saved me. The anger I had carried for 20 years, a heavy, bitter stone that I had swallowed as a boy and never been able to cough up, dissolved in an instant. It didn't fade. It didn't soften. It dissolved the way salt dissolves in water, completely and irreversibly, replaced by something so much larger and so much more painful that the anger seemed in retrospect like a mercy. Grief. Not the dull, distant grief I had felt when Miss Pemberton told me he was dead. Not the manageable arm's-length grief of losing someone who was already lost. This was a grief that had no bottom, a grief that opened up beneath me like a trap door, plunging me into a darkness I hadn't known existed. It was grief for the boy who thought his grandfather didn't love him. Grief for the years I had spent hating a man who was at that very moment sacrificing everything for me. Grief for the life we could have had together, the stones we could have skipped, the wood we could have shaped, the conversations we could have shared over the workbench, sawdust falling around us like snow. I put my head in my hands and I wept. Not the silent, controlled tears of a soldier who has learned to cry without making a sound. Not the quick, angry tears that come and go like summer rain. These were the deep, shuddering, full-body sobs of a man whose entire understanding of himself has been dismantled in the space of a single letter. They came from somewhere below my stomach, from somewhere I didn't know. I had a reservoir of grief that had been filling silently and steadily for 2 decades. I cried for the 8-year-old boy who woke up one morning and found his grandfather gone. I cried for the 10-year-old orphan who was told it was just an accident, just bad luck, just the way things go sometimes. I cried for the teenager in the foster homes who told himself he didn't need anyone who built walls so high and so thick that no light could get through. I cried for the soldier who volunteered for the most dangerous patrols because he didn't believe anyone would miss him if he didn't come back. I cried for the homeless man in the car eating cold canned soup in a parking lot alone in a way that most people can't even imagine. And I cried for Harlan, for my grandfather, for the man who had given up everything, his home, his family, his name, his dignity, to be hated by the people he loved most. As an act of love itself, a sacrifice so complete, so total, so unimaginable, that the weight of it bent the air around me. I sat there for what felt like hours. The beam of sunlight from the doorway crept across the concrete floor, lengthening as the afternoon surrendered to evening. The air inside the unit grew cooler. The sounds of the outside world, the wind in the pine trees, the distant hum of a truck on the highway seemed to come from very far away, muffled and indistinct, as if I were hearing them through water. My tears left clean tracks through the grime on my face. 2 pale lines running from my eyes to my jaw, evidence of something honest in a life that had been built on a lie. The world had tilted on its axis. The man I had resented was a hero. The pain I had nurtured was a misunderstanding. The loneliness I had accepted as my birthright was not a birthright at all, but a consequence, the collateral damage of a war I never knew was being fought on my behalf. It was too much. The sheer crushing weight of it all pressed down on me like a physical force, like the gravity had doubled in this small metal room. Part of me wanted to run, to slam the door shut, to walk back to the bus station, to return to the city, in the car, in the parking lots, in the day labor gigs. Back to the life I knew. A hard life, a painful life, but a simple one. One where the story was clear, where the villain was identified, where I knew who to blame for the way things had turned out. This new truth was not simple. It was complex and enormous, and it demanded something of me that I wasn't sure I had. It demanded that I forgive, not just Harlan, but myself, for all the years I had spent hating a man who deserved my gratitude, for all the energy I had poured into resentment when I could have been pouring it into something else, anything else. But I couldn't run. I knew that the way I knew my own heartbeat, walking away now would be the real abandonment, not his but mine. It would be a betrayal of his sacrifice, a confirmation that the 20 years he spent in exile, the 20 years of loneliness in silence and unsent letters had been for nothing. I owed him, not the debt of a grandson to a grandfather, but the deeper debt of a man who has been given a gift so costly that he can never repay it. I owed it to him to see this through, to understand the whole story, to read every letter opened, every box, and piece together the life he had lived in the shadows, so that I could live mine in the light. My hand, still trembling, reached for the letter on the floor. I picked it up, smoothed out the creases where my boots had pressed into it, and placed it carefully back in the ammo can. Then I took the next envelope from the stack. It was dated 1 week after he left. The handwriting was steadier on this one, the letters more controlled, as if the act of writing had given him something to hold on to. And the one after that dated a month later. And the one after that, there were dozens, scores, a lifetime of unsent letters. A one-sided conversation that had spanned 2 decades, each letter addressed to a boy, then a teenager, then a young man who would never read them. Until now. He had never stopped being my grandfather. He had just been doing it in silence in exile, writing letters to a ghost of his own. I was his ghost, the same way he was mine. Two phantoms haunting each other across a distance neither of us had chosen. I read them in order. Some were short, just a few lines. Some were pages long, the handwriting growing smaller and more cramped as he tried to fit more words onto the page. They were not filled with self-pity. They were not the ravings of a man drowning in regret. They were reports, dispatches from a life lived alone. He wrote about the jobs he took, carpentry work mostly, framing houses in small towns where no one asked too many questions, fixing barns, building cabinets, handyman work for widows and old couples who couldn't swing a hammer anymore. He moved often, never staying more than a year or two in any one place. Always small towns. Always places where a quiet man with good hands and no past could disappear into the background. He wrote about the books he was reading, classics on woodworking and joinery, but also novels, histories, books on philosophy and nature. He read Thoreau, he read Wendell Berry. He read about men who chose solitude, and I think he found some comfort in the idea that his isolation, though not chosen in the usual sense, could still be made meaningful. And he wrote about me. He had followed my life from a distance, piecing together fragments from public records, from the occasional news clipping, from whatever scraps of information he could find without breaking the terms of his agreement. He knew when I entered the foster system. He knew which schools I attended. He knew when I enlisted. "I am proud of you, Silas," one letter read. The words were underlined once with a single firm stroke. "But I am scared for you. The Army will give you structure, and you need that. But it will also take things from you that you won't realize are missing until years later. I hope you find peace in the service. Not just war. There is a difference between surviving and living, and I pray every night that you learn to tell them apart." I had to stop reading after that one. The precision of it, the way he had seen me, truly seen me, from hundreds of miles away, from behind a wall of enforced silence, was almost unbearable. He had understood me better from a distance than anyone had understood me up close. Better than the foster parents who fed me and housed me and never once asked what I was thinking. Better than the officers who commanded me and evaluated me and signed off on my discharge papers. Better than the VA counselors who checked boxes on their forms and told me to call a hotline if things got bad. He had known. Without being there, without being able to ask, he had known exactly who I was and exactly what I needed. And he had been powerless to give it to me. The afternoon had turned to evening. The light through the doorway was amber, now thick and warm, the color of honey. I pulled the tarps off the larger shapes against the wall. Underneath one was a canoe handmade at cedar strips fitted together with a precision that took my breath away. The wood gleamed even under a thick coat of dust, the grain running in long, graceful lines from bow to stern. It was beautiful. It was the kind of thing you see in a museum behind glass with a little placard explaining the craftsmanship. Under another tarp was a motorcycle, a vintage Triumph Bonneville, its chrome dulled but intact, its engine carefully prepped for long-term storage. The cylinders were plugged, the tank drained, the chain oiled and wrapped. He had put this machine to sleep the way a nurse puts a patient to sleep before surgery, with precision and care, in the full expectation that it would wake up again. These were not the possessions of a man who was destitute. He had rebuilt a life for himself, a quiet, solitary one built with his hands and his patience piece by careful piece. I opened a box labeled books. Inside were volumes on woodworking and engineering and architecture, their spines cracked from use. But there were also books on sustainable living, on off-grid power systems, on water purification and passive solar design. Books on homesteading, on building code of diamonds, on soil composition and well drilling. It was a library of self-sufficiency, a curriculum for a life lived outside the grid, outside the system, outside the reach of the world that had taken everything from him. The workbench pulled me back. The tools on the pegboard were old, but they were impeccable. The steel was clean, the edges sharp, the wooden handles worn smooth by decades of daily use. I ran my hand over the handle of a block plane, the same plane I had watched him use when I was a boy, and I could almost feel the warmth of his grip, still embedded in the wood. A phantom heat, a residue of a life lived in the service of craft. Tucked behind a row of chisels, pushed back against the pegboard as if it had been placed there deliberately out of sight, I found a rolled-up set of papers held together with a dried-out rubber band. The rubber crumbled when I touched it, falling away like old skin. I carefully unrolled the papers on the workbench, using a chisel and a hammer to hold down the curling edges. They were blueprints. Detailed, precise, hand-drawn blueprints for a small cabin. A one-bedroom structure with a kitchen, a living area, a bathroom, and a covered porch that faced west. Every joint was specified. Every measurement was noted in his small, neat handwriting. Every cut of lumber was calculated and listed in a material schedule that filled an entire page. Cross-sections showed the foundation, the framing, the roofing, the insulation. It was not a sketch. It was not a dream scribbled on a napkin. It was a fully realized, buildable, actionable construction plan, the kind of document you could hand to a contractor and say, "Build this." In the bottom right corner of the first page, in a small, neat title block, drawn with a straight edge, was the project name, The Haven, for Silas. My breath hitched. My vision blurred again. I blinked hard and looked away up at the corrugated steel ceiling, at the cobwebs in the corners, at anything that wasn't those three words in that careful handwriting. This was more than an inheritance, more than a storage unit full of old tools and memories. This was a plan. Bite the Heifer plan. A plan he had been building toward for years, maybe decades. A cabin, a home. For me. But a cabin needs land. And Ms. Pemberton had said there was no property, no real estate, no assets beyond this unit and its contents. Had he run out of money? Had the plan outgrown his resources? Was this just a blueprint for a dream that never came true? I spent the rest of the daylight hours sorting. I was methodical the way the Army had taught me to be. 3 piles. Keep, donate, Set aside. The set aside pile was for things I wasn't sure about, things that needed more time, more context, more understanding. The donate pile was remarkably small. Almost everything Harlan had kept was useful or beautiful, or imbued with some meaning that I could feel even if I couldn't yet articulate it. He had not been a man who accumulated junk. He had been a man who curated a life. As the last light faded, I found a small battery-powered lantern in a box labeled camping. It still worked. The warm yellow glow it cast over the unit made the space feel smaller, more intimate, less like a storage facility, and more like a room where someone had lived. Maybe he had, I realized. Maybe in a way this unit was the closest thing he had to a home. The one place where he kept the things that mattered most. The one place where he was still a grandfather, still a craftsman, still Harlan Calhoun, and not just a ghost working the odd jobs in towns where no one knew his name. I sat on the iron-bound chest with the lantern on the workbench beside me and read more letters. 10, 15, each one a window into a life I had never known existed. He wrote about the changing seasons and places I'd never been, about a dog he'd befriended at a job site that followed him home and stayed with him for 3 years until it died of old age, about a sunset he saw over a lake in Vermont that made him think of teaching me to skip stones. I wished you were there, Silas. I wish you were always there. The letters were his company. Writing them was his ritual, his way of keeping the connection alive, even if the wire was cut, even if no signal could travel along it. He was talking to me every week, every month for 20 years. I just couldn't hear him. The next morning, I woke up inside the unit. I had fallen asleep on the concrete floor, my duffel bag under my head, the lantern dead beside me. The early morning light was gray and flat, seeping through the open doorway. Birds were singing somewhere in the pine trees beyond the fence. My back ached, my neck was stiff, and for one disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. Then I saw the workbench, the tools, the letters scattered around me on the floor where I had been reading them, and it all came back. The weight of it settled onto my chest like a physical thing, heavy and warm and inescapable. I had a mission now, the wooden chest. It sat against the wall where it had been since I first opened the unit, its iron straps dark with age, its heavy lids sealed with a built-in lock. Not a padlock. An integrated lock, the old-fashioned kind, set directly into the wood and iron of the chest itself. The keyhole was large, ornate shape for a skeleton key, the brass key from Miss Pemberton's office. I pulled it from my pocket. It was warm again from sleeping next to me all night, pressed against my thigh through the thin fabric of my pocket. I knelt in front of the chest. The keyhole was at eye level, a dark, tarnished oval set into an iron plate. I slid the key in. It fit perfectly, the teeth engaging the mechanism with a smooth, precise click that felt almost ceremonial. I turned the key. The mechanism inside groaned a deep metallic sound, the sound of gears and levers that hadn't moved in years, reluctantly coming back to life. Then a release. A heavy, satisfying clunk like a bolt sliding home. I lifted the lid. The hinges protested, their joints stiff with age, but they held. The lid was heavy, solid oak reinforced with iron, and it took both hands to push it upright until it leaned against the wall behind the chest. The top layer was what I expected. More pieces of my childhood preserved with the same care as the box labeled Silas, age 6 to 8. Report cards from schools I barely remembered printed on paper that had yellowed to the color of old teeth. He must have gotten copies somehow, through what channels or what favors I couldn't imagine. Drawings I had made in crayon, stick figures and houses with triangular roofs and suns with radiating lines. A plaster cast of my handprint, small enough to fit inside the palm I had now, the fingers short and stubby, the plaster chipped at one edge. I held the handprint cast against my own hand. My fingers extended past the plaster by 2 full inches. 20 years of growth, of change, of becoming someone the boy who made this cast could never have predicted. I wondered if Harlan had done the same thing, if he had held this small white hand against his own rough palm and tried to imagine what it would become. I set the childhood things aside, gently placing each item on the workbench with the same care I'd use handling a detonator. Then I looked back into the chest. The bottom was flat, smooth wood, unbroken, unremarkable, but something about it didn't look right. The interior of the chest was shallower than the exterior suggested. The math didn't add up. The walls were thick, yes, but not thick enough to account for the discrepancy. There were at least 4 inches of chest that were unaccounted for. My fingers traced the edges of the bottom panel. Smooth, seamless, almost. In the back right corner, barely perceptible, there was a small notch, a fingernail-width groove cut into the wood just deep enough to hook a fingertip into. A false bottom. My heart was hammering again. That frantic, caged rhythm. I worked my finger into the notch and pulled. The panel resisted for a moment, then lifted. It was a beautifully fitted piece of woodwork cut to such tight tolerances that it had created its own seal, the kind of craftsmanship that only a master carpenter could achieve. It came free with a soft, woody sigh, like a drawer opening in an old desk. I stared at what was underneath. The space beneath the false bottom was about 4 inches deep and lined with green, felt the kind you see on pool tables. And it was filled. Cash. Stacks of it. $100 bills, 50s, 20s, all neatly bundled in paper bands, each band labeled with an amount in Harlan's handwriting. The stacks were packed tightly arranged with the same precision as the tools on the pegboard, each one aligned with the others. Edges flush. I counted one stack, $5,000. 50 bills, each one 100. I counted the stacks. There were at least 20, maybe more. My mind did the math and then refused to believe it. $100,000, maybe more. More money than I had ever seen in my life. More money than I had earned in my entire adult life combined. Next to the money occupying the remaining space in the hidden compartment was a large manila envelope. It was thick, its sides bulging with documents. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal clasp. I bent the clasp back and slid the contents out onto the workbench. Official documents. The kind of papers that have watermarks and embossed seals and signatures from notaries. A birth certificate, mine the original, not a copy, a social security card, and beneath them a document that I had to read 3 times before the words resolved into meaning. A quitclaim deed, free and clear, no liens, no encumbrances, for 5 acres of undeveloped land bordering a national forest located 3 miles outside of Pine Hollow. It was dated 6 months ago. It was in my name. Silas Calhoun. He had bought the land and put it in my name. Before he died, before the will, before the lawyer, he had already given it to me. Legally, officially, irrevocably. 5 acres of forest and a stream and a future that I hadn't known existed until this moment. The money, the deed, the blueprints, the tools. It all clicked into place with the precision of a dovetail joint, each piece fitting into the next, no gaps, no excess, no waste. This was not a random collection of an old man's possessions. This was a rescue package, assembled over 20 years, funded by 20 years of labor, designed by 20 years of thought. Every dollar in that chest was a piece of his penance. Every hour he had spent at that workbench, designing the cabin, drawing the blueprints, calculating the materials, was a prayer that his grandson might one day have the life that was stolen from him. He had given me a future, a complete, fully equipped, ready-to-build future. Land to stand on, money to start with, plans to follow, tools to use, and his letters to guide me. I sat on the floor. I couldn't stand anymore. My legs gave out the way they had after a firefight in Helmand, when the adrenaline drained and the body remembered it was just flesh and bone. I sat on the cold concrete with my back against the iron-bound chest, the money and the deed, and the blueprints spread out on the floor around me, like the pieces of a life I was only now beginning to assemble. It was then that I reached for the last envelope. It was at the very bottom of the ammo can, in its own separate sealed envelope, thicker than the others. On the front, in handwriting that was shakier than any of the previous letters, Just 3 words. When you know. I figured $100,000 in a set of blueprints with my name on them qualified. The writing inside was unsteady. The loops were less certain, the lines wavering. This letter had been written recently by a hand weakened by age or illness, or both. The ink varied in pressure, dark in some places, faint in others, as if the pen had been gripped and regripped by fingers that kept losing their strength. Silas, I hope by now you have found the tools, the money, the land. I hope you have read my other letters and you have begun to understand. I don't expect you to forgive me. Not right away. Forgiveness is a slow, patient thing like growing a tree from a seed. It takes years and rain and sun and the simple, stubborn willingness to not give up. All I ask is that you understand why I did what I did. I understood. The understanding was a physical sensation, a warmth spreading through my chest, displacing the cold that had lived there for years. I understood, and the understanding hurt in a way that anger never had. Anger is a wall. Understanding is a window. And sometimes the view through the window is worse than the darkness behind the wall. There is one last thing you need to know. It is the hardest part of this whole story, and I have put off writing it until the end. I have started this paragraph 20 times and thrown it away each time. But you deserve the truth, Silas. All of it. Even the parts that will make you want to burn this letter and forget you ever read it. It is about your parents. My blood went cold. A literal physical chill that started in my hands and swept inward toward my heart. I could feel the temperature drop in my fingers and my toes, as if my body was pulling its warmth inward, protecting its core from a blow it knew was coming. The official story is that your mother and father died in a car accident, a single vehicle crash on a wet road on a November night. The car left the road on a curve, struck a tree. No other vehicles involved. The police report concluded that it was caused by excessive speed and poor weather conditions. That is what you were told. That is what everyone believes. It is not the truth. The letters on the page seemed to vibrate. I couldn't tell if my hands were shaking or if the words themselves were trembling. The men your father owed money to after I left, they backed off for a while, just like we agreed. Your father was trying. He was going to Gamblers Anonymous. He had a steady job at a warehouse. He was making small payments, regular ones showing good faith. And for a year, maybe a little more, it worked. The pressure eased. The dark cars stopped appearing. The threats went silent. But he was in too deep, Silas. The debt was too large. He missed a payment. Then he missed another. And these men, they decided it was time to send a message that couldn't be misunderstood. The brakes on your parents' car did not fail because of the rain. They did not fail because of poor maintenance or a manufacturing defect. They were cut, deliberately, professionally. The brake lines were severed in a way that would cause a gradual loss of pressure, not an immediate one. The brakes would feel normal for the first few miles, and then at the exact moment they were needed most on a curve in the rain at speed, they would fail completely. It was not an accident, Silas. It was a murder, staged to look like a tragedy. The air left my lungs in a single violent rush, as if someone had punched me in the solar plexus. The unit contracted around me, the walls pressing in the ceiling, dropping. The sounds of the outside world, the wind, the birds, the distant hum of life, faded to a dull roaring static like radio interference. My vision narrowed to a tunnel, the letter at the center, the words on the page, the truth on the paper. My parents were murdered. The grief I had carried for them for 19 years had been a clean grief. Simple. Terrible but simple. A car accident. Bad luck. Bad weather. The kind of random, senseless tragedy that could happen to anyone. There was no one to blame, no one to hate, no one to rage against. Just the rain and the road and the cold mathematics of velocity and friction. This new knowledge was something else entirely. It was jagged. It was dirty. It was poisoned at its edges with a rage so vast and so bottomless that I could feel it pulling at me like a current trying to drag me under. I found out a few months after it happened. The letter continued. A man I knew from the old days, a friend of a friend, he had contacts in the police department. He told me the file was closed. The official story was set in stone. The people responsible were too insulated, too connected. Going to the authorities would have been a death sentence for me, and worse, it would have put you right back in their sights. They would have known you were out there, an orphan, a loose end, a piece of unfinished business. So I did the only thing I could. I stayed a ghost. I watched you from afar. I made sure you were safe, even if it meant you were alone. Every dollar in that chest, Silas, is a piece of my penance. I earned it with these hands, one board, one nail, one joint at a time. Every hour I spent at that workbench designing your cabin was a prayer that you might one day have the life that was stolen from your parents, the home they never got to build for you. The land is clean. It is in your name. The money is untraceable, earned in cash, saved in cash. The blueprints are a guide, nothing more. Build what you want. Build a life of peace. Don't let the anger over what happened consume you, son. It almost consumed me. There were nights when I lay awake planning terrible things, when I imagined driving to the city and finding those men and doing things I will not put into writing. But I didn't. Not because I am strong, but because I remembered your face. The face of a 6-year-old boy on the steps of my workshop, grinning with sawdust in his hair. That face saved me, Silas. It pulled me back from the edge every single time. Those men, they feed on misery. They profit from destruction. Don't give them the satisfaction. Living well, building something good, being happy, that is the only revenge that matters. It is the only revenge they can never take from you. Be the man your mother and father knew you could be. Be the man I know you are. I love you, Silas. I have always loved you. I never stopped. Not for one day. Not for 1 hour. Now go build your home. Your loving grandfather, Harlan. The letter lay in my hands. The last light of the evening was coming through the door, now orange and deep, the color of embers. The shadows in the unit had grown so long that they had merged, filling the space with a warm, soft darkness that felt less like absence and more like presence, as if the darkness itself was something that had been placed there carefully with intention. The rage was there. I won't pretend it wasn't. It was a white-hot coal in the center of my chest, burning with a heat that could have powered a furnace. My parents, murdered, by men who had never been punished, never been held to account, never lost a moment's sleep. Men who had cut a brake line and gone home to their families and slept in warm beds while a 10-year-old boy stood in a school hallway and learned that the world had just ended. But underneath the rage, his words had planted something, a seed, small and fragile and barely alive, but real. Living well is the only revenge that matters. He had spent 20 years in exile, not plotting vengeance, not gathering evidence, not building a case. He had spent 20 years building a rescue package. He had turned his grief and his guilt and his rage into lumber and blueprints and $100 bills, into something that could grow, into something that could save. The rage and the seed existed in the same space, fighting for the same soil. I sat there until the light was completely gone, holding the letter, breathing, just breathing, letting both things live inside me without choosing between them. Not yet. That choice would come later. For now, it was enough to sit in the dark with the truth and let it settle. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound was violent in the deep silence, a harsh electronic vibration that shattered the stillness like a stone through glass. I fumbled for it, my fingers clumsy, my hands slick. The screen lit up painfully bright in the darkness, and I squinted at an unknown number. The area code was the city's. I answered. Hello, Mr. Calhoun. It's Patricia Pemberton. Her voice was as crisp as ever, but there was a new edge to it, a tightness that hadn't been there in her office. I'm glad I reached you. I tried several times this afternoon. I've been busy, I said. My voice sounded strange to me, rough and hollowed out, the voice of a man who has been crying for hours and is pretending he hasn't. I understand, and I'm sorry to call so late, but I'm afraid I have some news. The development corporation Pinnacle Development Group, they have moved up their construction schedule. There was an issue with one of their other projects, some kind of permit delay in another state, and they have decided to fast-track the Pine Hollow site to keep their investors happy. The words were coming at me from a distance, reaching me through layers of emotion and exhaustion. They've invoked a clause in the municipal agreement, a force majeure provision that allows them to accelerate the timeline if construction circumstances change. All storage leases at North Fork are being terminated, effective immediately. What does that mean? I asked, though I already knew. I could feel the answer coming the way you feel a storm approaching, that drop in pressure, that change in the air. It means the 6-month window is gone, Mr. Calhoun. You have 14 days, 2 weeks from today. After that, Pinnacle takes possession of the facility and demolishes everything. Anything left inside any unit becomes their property. 14 days. The words hit me like a physical blow, a hammer strike to the sternum. 14 days to sort through a man's entire life. 14 days to process 20 years of secrets and sacrifice. 14 days to move a workshop, a canoe, a motorcycle, hundreds of letters, and $100,000 in cash. They're offering a small buyout to all leaseholders as compensation for the early termination. Ms. Pemberton continued, $300 per unit. It's insultingly low, but the legal clause is ironclad. I've looked at it. My colleagues have looked at it. There's no room to challenge it. $300 for the contents of a life, for a workshop that had taken 20 years to assemble, for a rescue package that had been funded by a lifetime of labor and loneliness. $300. Mr. Calhoun, are you still there? I looked around the unit, at the workbench with its scars and stains, at the tools hanging in their outlined places, at the cedar canoe and the Triumph motorcycle, and the stacks of letters and the chest full of money, and the blueprints for a cabin that a dead man had designed for a grandson he could never see. 14 days. It was impossible. It was absurd. It was the latest in a lifetime of impossible, absurd timelines that the world had handed me. Clear this building in 6 hours. Patrol this valley in 4 days. Process this grief in no time at all. But I was a soldier, and soldiers don't get to say it can't be done. Soldiers get a mission and they execute. They adapt. They overcome. They find a way, or they die trying. I'm here, I said. My voice was low and steady, and I was surprised by the sound of it. It was the voice I had used in Afghanistan, the voice that came out when the situation was worst and the options were fewest. Not the voice of a homeless man with $43. The voice of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done. Tell them they'll have their unit. I'll have it cleared. I hung up the phone. The screen went dark. The silence of the storage unit wrapped around me again, thick and total. I looked around the small, cluttered space one more time. The lantern was dead. The only light came from the stars visible through the open doorway and from the faint glow of a quarter moon that hung above the pine trees like a broken coin. It wasn't a burden anymore. It was an armory. It was a base of operations. It was a mission briefing and a supply depot and a reason to wake up tomorrow. For the first time since I had taken off my uniform, for the first time in 5 years of drifting and surviving and slowly disappearing, I knew exactly what I had to do. 14 days, $100,000, 5 acres of land, a set of blueprints, a workshop full of tools, and a dead man's faith that I could use them. The first morning of the 14 days began at 4:30 a.m. I hadn't set an alarm. My body woke itself the way it used to wake in Afghanistan, suddenly and completely, a switch flipping from unconscious to operational with no transition between them. One moment I was asleep on the concrete floor of the storage unit, my duffel bag under my head, Harlan's army blanket over my legs. The next moment I was standing, my eyes open, my mind already running through the day's tasks like a mission briefing. I had 14 days, 336 hours, 20,160 minutes. Every one of them counted. Every one of them was a piece of time that I would either use or lose, and losing was not something I could afford. Not now, not when a dead man had spent 20 years building me a future that a corporation was about to bulldoze into rubble. I needed a truck. That was the first problem. You don't move a workshop, a canoe, a motorcycle, and a lifetime of carefully curated possessions on a city bus. I needed wheels, big ones, and I needed them today. The money in the chest changed everything and nothing. It changed what was possible. It didn't change who I was. I was still the man who had slept in a Chevy Cavalier for 3 years, who knew the price of every item on every dollar menu in the city, who could make a bar of soap last 6 weeks. I wasn't going to start spending Harlan's money like it was water. Every dollar in that chest had been earned by his hands, one board at a time, one nail at a time, over 20 years of exile. I would spend what was necessary and not a cent more. I walked into Pine Hollow as the sun was coming up. The town looked different in the early morning light, softer, less tired. The buildings on the main street were still old and faded, but the dawn gave them a warmth that the afternoon sun had baked out of them. A dog trotted across the street with a purposeful air going somewhere important. A flag hung limp outside the post office waiting for a breeze. The only place open was Nadine's Diner. A bell above the door jingled as I walked in, a small, cheerful sound that felt almost aggressive in the early morning quiet. The place was simple: a long counter with red vinyl stools, a row of booths along the window, the smell of coffee and bacon, and something baking that I couldn't identify, but that made my stomach clench with a hunger I'd been ignoring for days. A woman stood behind the counter. She was in her 60s maybe, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and forearms that suggested she had been lifting cast iron skillets for most of her life. She had the kind of face that had been pretty once and was now something better. Honest, weathered. The face of someone who had seen enough of life to stop being impressed by it, but hadn't stopped caring about it. "Sit anywhere, honey," she said without looking up from the coffee she was pouring. I sat at the counter. She set a mug in front of me and filled it without asking. The coffee was strong and hot and tasted like it had been brewed by someone who understood that coffee is not a beverage, but a necessity. "You're the one staying out at North Fork," she said. It wasn't a question. I looked at her. Word travels fast. Town, this small word, doesn't have to travel at all. It just kind of stands in one place and everybody walks past it. She extended her hand across the counter. "Nadine Corwin. Silas Calhoun." Her hand was warm and calloused, and her grip was firm. She held my hand for a half-second longer than a handshake required, and in that half-second, she looked at me with an expression that I recognized. It was the look of someone who was making a decision about you not based on your clothes or your haircut or the amount of money in your pocket, but on something less tangible, something in your eyes. Whatever she saw, she seemed satisfied. She released my hand and turned to the grill. "What'll you have? Whatever's cheapest." She snorted. "I didn't ask what you could afford. I asked what you want." I hadn't been asked that question in a long time. Not by a doctor, not by a caseworker, not by a shelter coordinator. I had been asked what I needed, what I qualified for, what was available. Never what I wanted. "Eggs," I said. "Scrambled, bacon, toast. That's more like it." She cooked in silence, and I drank my coffee and watched the town wake up through the window. A pickup truck rumbled past. A woman opened the door of the post office and propped it with a brick. An old man in a canvas jacket walked slowly down the sidewalk, his hands clasped behind his back, taking his morning constitutional with the deliberate pace of someone who had nowhere to be and all day to get there. Nadine set a plate in front of me. It was enormous. Eggs, bacon, toast, hash browns, and a side of something golden and crumbly that turned out to be cornbread. "I didn't order all this," I said. "I know. Eat it anyway." I ate. It was the best meal I'd had in months, maybe years. The eggs were cooked in butter, the bacon was thick and crispy, and the cornbread was still warm from the oven. I ate every bite, and when I was done, Nadine refilled my coffee and leaned against the counter. Harlan's grandson, she said quietly, as if the name itself required a certain reverence. I nodded. He used to come in here, not often. He wasn't what you'd call social, but every couple of weeks he'd sit right where you're sitting and order the same thing, eggs, bacon, toast. Never said much, tipped like he was trying to pay off the national debt. She paused. Good man, quiet but good. You could see it in his hands. The way he held his coffee cup, the way he folded his napkin. Careful, like everything he touched mattered. My throat tightened. I stared at the counter. I heard about the 14 days, she said. Pinnacle's been throwing their weight around this town for months. Half the people here are scared of them. The other half are too tired to fight. I'm not looking for a fight, I said. I just need to move his things. You need a truck. I need a truck. Talk to Vernon Loomis. He runs the hardware store. He's got an old flatbed he doesn't use anymore. And he owes me a favor. She wrote something on a napkin and slid it across the counter. An address. Tell him Nadine sent you. I reached for my wallet. She waved me off. Your grandfather overpaid for every meal he ever ate in here. Consider this one on his tab. The hardware store opened at 7. I was standing outside at 6:55. Vernon Loomis arrived at 6:58, walking up the sidewalk with a set of keys in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. He was a man in his mid-70s, lean and angular, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hardwood that Harlan used to work. Deep lines around his eyes and mouth, a nose that had been broken at least once, and hands that were scarred and knobby and enormously capable. He looked at me standing outside his door, took in my fatigues, my worn boots, my unshaven face, and said, "You're Harlan's boy, not grandson, boy." As if the relationship was more direct than biology, as if Harlan had talked about me in terms that erased the generation between us. Yes, sir. He unlocked the door and held it open. Come on in. The hardware store was a time capsule. Floor-to-ceiling shelves stacked with everything from roofing nails to kerosene lamps. The wooden floor creaked under every step. The air smelled of metal and lubricant and the faint, sweet scent of cedar shavings from a display of fence posts near the back. It was the kind of store that had been replaced everywhere else by big box chains. The kind of store where the owner knew where everything was because he'd put it there himself 40 years ago. Vernon poured coffee from his thermos into 2 mugs and handed me one without ceremony. We stood at the counter and he studied me the way a carpenter studies a piece of wood before making the first cut, evaluating the grain, looking for flaws, deciding what it could become. Nadine called me last night, he said, told me about the 14 days. She gave me your address. She would. He took a slow sip of coffee. I knew your grandfather for about 12 years. He showed up in Pine Hollow one winter, took a room at the motel on Route 9 and started looking for work. I needed someone to help me rebuild a barn roof that a snowstorm had taken down. He showed up with his own tools, didn't say 10 words the whole first day, and did the work of 3 men. He set his mug down and looked at me with eyes that were clear and sharp and held no sentiment that wasn't earned. Best carpenter I ever saw. And I've been in this business 51 years. His joints were tight enough to hold without glue. His measurements were accurate to a 32nd of an inch. He could look at a piece of wood and see the thing inside it the way a sculptor sees the statue inside the marble. He kept to himself, Vernon continued, never talked about where he came from, never talked about family, but his work talked for him. Honest work. The kind that doesn't need a signature because anyone who knows craft can tell who did it just by looking. Vernon paused and something shifted in his expression. Something softer, something that cost him. He fixed houses for people who couldn't pay. Widows, old couples on fixed income, people whose porches were rotting or whose roofs were leaking and who couldn't afford a contractor. He'd show up on a Saturday morning, tools in his truck, and just start working. Wouldn't take a dime. Wouldn't even tell them his full name most of the time. Just Harlan, just the work. I gripped my coffee mug with both hands. The heat was almost painful, but I didn't let go. There are 7 houses in this town that are still standing because of your grandfather, Vernon said. 7 families who stayed warm through the winter because a man they barely knew spent his weekends rebuilding what time and poverty were tearing down. He never asked for credit, never asked for thanks. He just did it, and then he went home. Home. The word landed in my chest. His home had been a rented room and a storage unit. His home had been a workbench and a stack of unsent letters. And yet he had spent his weekends making sure other people had homes. "You need a truck," Vernon said. It was a statement. "Yes, sir." He reached under the counter and produced a set of keys, old and scratched, attached to a faded leather fob. "Got a '79 Ford flatbed out back. She's ugly as sin and burns oil like a bonfire, but she runs. Harlan helped me rebuild the engine about 6 years ago. Took us 3 weekends. He wouldn't let me pay him, so I told him I owed him a favor." He set the keys on the counter between us. "I figure this is the favor." I tried to pay him. He refused. I tried to argue. He raised one eyebrow, a gesture so precisely calibrated in its stubbornness that I understood I was dealing with the same species of man as my grandfather. I took the keys. The next 12 days were a blur of controlled chaos. I lived on coffee and adrenaline and Nadine's cooking and the stubborn gravitational pull of purpose. For the first time in years, I had a reason to be awake at dawn, a reason to push my body until my muscles screamed and my hands bled, a reason to plan, to organize, to think in terms of what comes next instead of what went wrong. I drove Vernon's flatbed between the storage unit and the land every day, sometimes twice. The land was everything Harlan's letters had hinted at and more. 5 acres at the end of a dirt road that wound through towering ponderosa pines, their bark the color of cinnamon, their branches filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns on the forest floor. A small, clear stream cut through one corner of the property, running over smooth stones with a sound that was constant and soft and deeply, profoundly peaceful. The kind of sound that rewires your nervous system, that tells the ancient animal part of your brain that this is a safe place that you can rest here. I set up the workbench first. I cleared a flat area under a stand of pines, laid down a heavy tarp, and assembled the bench on top of it. I hung the pegboard between 2 trees and placed the tools in their outlines exactly as Harlan had arranged them. Standing there in the open air with the forest around me and the stream at my back, that workbench looked like an altar, a place of devotion, a place where something sacred had been practiced for a very long time. The first things I moved were the tools in the chest, then the canoe strapped carefully to the flatbed, its cedar hull catching the morning light like honey. Then the motorcycle rolled up a ramp of planks and tied down with ratchet straps that I bought at Vernon's store on a tab he insisted on keeping. Then the boxes, dozens of them, books, kitchen supplies, winter clothes, camping gear, each one carried to the truck, driven to the land unloaded and stacked under a second tarp that I'd rigged between the trees. It was brutal physical work, the kind that leaves your shirt soaked through by 9 in the morning and your lower back howling by noon, and I loved every minute of it. On the 3rd day, a pickup truck appeared at the storage facility while I was loading boxes. A young man got out. He was maybe 19 or 20 with a rangy build, sun-bleached hair, and the kind of permanent tan that comes from working outdoors since childhood. He wore a t-shirt from a feed store and boots that were held together with determination. "You the guy moving out at a 217?" he asked. "That's me. I'm Tanner Briggs. Nadine's my aunt. She said you might need a hand." I looked at him. He looked back with an expression that was neither eager nor reluctant, just available. Ready. The expression of a young man who understood that work was not something you waited to be asked to do, but something you showed up for. "I can't pay much," I said. "Nadine said you'd say that. She also said to tell you that I'm saving up for college, and I'm not too proud to take your money." I almost smiled. It was a sensation I barely recognized, a loosening of muscles in my face that had been clenched for so long I'd forgotten they could move in that direction. Tanner worked hard. He was strong in the way that young men who have grown up hauling hay bales and digging fence posts are strong, not gym strong, but work strong, the kind of strength that has endurance built into it. He didn't talk much while we worked, which I appreciated. But during breaks, sitting on the tailgate of the flatbed, drinking water from plastic jugs, he talked about his plans. Community college first, then maybe a state university. He wanted to study engineering. He wanted to build things. "Your granddad built the shelves in our church," he said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. "The ones in the library room. Mrs. Hardcastle told me about it. Said he showed up one day when nobody was there and just started building them. Didn't ask anyone. Didn't charge anything. When the pastor came by and asked who he was, he said his name was Harlan, and could he please be left alone to work?" Tanner shook his head, a gesture of quiet admiration. "The shelves are still there. Been there 8 years. Never sagged, never warped. The books sit on them like they were born there." Every story about Harlan that I heard in Pine Hollow was like that. Small, quiet, unasked for. The man had moved through this town like water through soil, invisible but essential, leaving behind a network of small kindnesses that people discovered only after he was gone. On the 8th day, I met Boyd Rafferty. I was at Vernon's store buying rope and tarps when an older man walked in. He was in his late 70s with a military bearing that time and age had softened but not erased. His back was straight, his shoulders square, his gray hair cut close. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into clean jeans and boots that were old but meticulously maintained. Vernon introduced us. "Silas, this is Boyd Rafferty, retired sheriff's deputy. Boyd, this is Harlan Calhoun's grandson." Boyd's eyes sharpened when Vernon said Harlan's name. He looked at me the way a man looks at a letter he has been expecting for a long time, with recognition, with gravity. "I knew your grandfather," he said. His voice was low and measured the voice of a man who had spent decades choosing his words carefully, because in his profession, the wrong word could end a life or save one. "So I keep hearing." Not the way these folks knew him. They knew the carpenter, the quiet man who fixed their houses. He paused. "I knew the rest." Something in his tone made the air between us change. Vernon, who had been arranging boxes of nails on a shelf, went still. "Can we talk?" Boyd asked. "Somewhere private." We sat in Vernon's back office, a small, cluttered room that smelled of machine oil and old receipts. Vernon closed the door behind us, but I could tell from the way he lingered that he knew more than he'd let on. Boyd sat in a straight-back chair across from me, his hands folded on his knee, and he talked. He told me that he had been a sheriff's deputy in a county 3 hours north years ago, that he had known Harlan not through Pine Hollow, but through a connection that preceded both of their arrivals in this town. He told me that he was the man who had tipped Harlan off about my parents. "I had a contact in the police department in your parents' city," Boyd said, "a detective who owed me a favor from a case we'd worked together years before. When your parents died, the report came across as a standard accident. Single vehicle, wet road, excessive speed, open and shut, but my contact, he was thorough. He noticed things that didn't add up. Tool marks on the brake lines, the angle of the cut, the fact that the car had been parked in an open driveway accessible to anyone the night before." Boyd's voice was steady, but his hands folded on his knee were gripping each other with a pressure that whitened his knuckles. He couldn't do anything with it. The people involved had connections, not just in the streets, but in the system. The kind of people who make problems disappear by making the people who notice the problems disappear. He filed his observations in a supplemental report that was quietly buried. And he told me, and I told Harlan. I sat very still. The room felt small. The air felt thin. "Your grandfather wanted to go to war," Boyd said. "I've seen a lot of men in my career, Silas. Men who've been pushed to the edge. Your grandfather was on the edge. He wanted to find those men and end them. And he could have. I believe that. I've seen what a man with nothing left to lose is capable of. Boyd leaned forward, but he didn't. And do you know why? I shook my head. Because of you. Because if he went to war, he'd either end up dead or in prison, and either way, you'd lose the last person in the world who gave a damn about you. You were in the foster system. You were invisible, and he was the only one watching, the only one keeping track. If he took himself out of the equation even from a distance, you'd have been truly alone. So he stayed a ghost, I said. Boyd nodded slowly. He stayed a ghost. He made his peace with never seeing justice. He turned that anger into something else. He started building cabinets and shelves and porches and saving money and buying land and drawing plans for a house that he would never live in. All for you. Boyd reached into his shirt pocket and produced a small folded photograph. It was old, creased at the folds, its colors faded. He held it for a moment looking at it, and then he handed it to me. He gave me this years ago, asked me to hold on to it, said it was the most important thing he owned. I unfolded the photograph. It was a picture of me, a young man in army dress uniform standing in a line of other soldiers the day of basic training graduation. The photo had been taken from a distance, from the bleachers maybe, or from the edge of the parade ground. I was small in the frame, one face among many, but someone had circled my head with a ballpoint pen, a thin blue ring around the face of a soldier who didn't know he was being watched. He was there. My voice broke on the second word. The crack ran right through the middle of the question, splitting it into two pieces that fell away from each other. Boyd nodded. He drove 9 hours, sat in the back of the stands, wore a hat and sunglasses, watched the whole ceremony, cried the whole time, he told me later. Said it was the proudest and the saddest moment of his life. Proud because you had become a man. Sad because he couldn't walk up to you and tell you. I looked at the photograph, at the tiny circled face, at the blue ink ring drawn by a hand that I now knew as well as my own. A hand that had carved wooden soldiers and skipped stones and written hundreds of letters that were never sent. A hand that had held mine by the river when I was small enough to believe that being held was enough to keep you safe. He had been there, 30 feet away, maybe less. Close enough to hear the sergeant call my name. Close enough to see me take the oath. Close enough to reach out and touch me. If only the world had been different. If only the deal hadn't been struck. If only the men with the money and the malice and the cold, sharp tools hadn't drawn the boundaries of his life with threats. He had been right there, and he had walked away. Again. Because walking away was the only way he knew how to love me. I closed my hand around the photograph. The paper crumpled slightly against my palm, the way a living thing folds when you hold it. I pressed it against my chest, against the same pocket where his letters had ridden for days. He was the strongest man I ever knew, Boyd said quietly. Not because he could endure pain. Plenty of men can endure pain. He was strong because he chose to endure it. Every single day for 20 years he made the same choice. To stay hidden. To stay silent. To stay a ghost. Not because it was easy, because it was necessary. I couldn't speak. The words were there, somewhere inside me, but they couldn't find their way past the thing in my throat, the hard, aching mass that had been growing since I first opened that ammo can and saw my name painted in white letters. Boyd stood up. He put his hand on my shoulder, a brief, firm pressure, the touch of a man who understood that some griefs are too big for words and too important for silence. Build the house, son, he said. That's what he wanted. That's all he ever wanted. The last day at the storage unit was the 12th day. I had pushed hard, worked long, and the unit was empty. Completely, utterly empty. Just a hollow metal box, 10 feet by 20, its concrete floor swept clean, its wall bare, its air stripped of the smells that had filled it for 2 decades. The sawdust was gone. The canvas and wood and oil were gone. The letters were gone, packed carefully in a waterproof container and stored under a tarp on the land. Everything was gone. I swept the floor one last time. The broom pushed dust into a small pile near the door, a final accumulation of all the years this space had held a man's life in trust. I swept it out into the gravel lane and watched it scatter in the breeze. I stood in the doorway, my hand on the roll-up door, ready to pull it down for the last time. The late afternoon sun threw my shadow deep into the empty unit, a long dark shape on the clean concrete. I looked at that shadow at the outline of a man standing in a doorway, and I thought about Harlan standing in the same spot 20 years ago, looking at the space he had chosen to hold the pieces of a life he could no longer live. A sleek black SUV pulled into the lane. It moved slowly, deliberately, the way expensive vehicles move in places where expensive vehicles don't belong. It stopped behind Vernon's flatbed and a man got out. He was in his 40s, fit in the way that money makes people fit, with a suit that cost more than my car and a haircut that cost more than my boots. He had the face of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered, the face of someone who saw the world as a series of transactions, each one tilted in his favor. Graham Holt, Pinnacle Development Group. I knew his name from the paperwork Mrs. Pemberton had sent. "You're the one in 217, he said. His voice was smooth and sure, the voice of a man who asked questions he already knew the answers to. "I am." He looked past me into the empty unit. A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprised, maybe, that it was actually done. He had probably expected to find it still full, to have an excuse to seize the contents, to add one more small victory to his collection. "Good," he said. "We're right on schedule. You know, we're doing this town a real service. Jobs, tourism, economic development. Pine Hollow has been dying on the vine for decades. We're bringing it back to life." He smiled. It was the smile of a man who believed his own narrative so completely that he couldn't imagine anyone seeing it differently. A resort where a storage facility used to be. Progress measured in hotel rooms and golf courses, in seasonal employment at minimum wage. I looked at him. I looked at his suit and his SUV and his confidence and his absolute unshakable certainty that what he was doing was right. And I felt the anger still there, still burning, but controlled now, banked like coals in a stove, producing heat without flame. He had no idea what this place meant. He had no idea what had been stored here. Not tools and furniture and letters, but a man's love for his grandson, a love so fierce and so patient that it had outlasted exile and silence and death itself. Graham Holt saw a plot of land in a demolition schedule. He saw square footage and profit margins and investor returns. He didn't see the pencil outlines on the pegboard. He didn't see the circled face in a graduation photo. He didn't see the stack of letters written in the dark by a man who had no one to talk to but the ghost of an 8-year-old boy. I reached up and grabbed the handle of the roll-up door. "Good luck with your progress," I said. I pulled the door down. It came fast and hard, the metal thundering against the frame, the sound echoing through the empty facility like a cannon shot. The bang rolled down the lane between the storage buildings and faded into the pine trees beyond the fence. I snapped a new padlock onto the hasp. A lock I had bought at Vernon's store, the last item on my tab, a tab I would pay in full before the week was out. I turned the key, pulled it free, and held it out to Graham Holt. He took it. His fingers were soft, the fingers of a man who had never held a chisel or swung a hammer or spent a Saturday morning on his knees rebuilding a stranger's porch because it was the right thing to do. I picked up my duffel bag from the gravel. I walked to the flatbed. I didn't look back. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the best of my life. They were hard in the way that good things are hard, the way a long run is hard, the way an honest conversation is hard, the way loving someone who can't love you back is hard. The pain was real, but it was productive. It was building something. I used a portion of the money for a down payment on a reliable used truck and a small secondhand camper trailer, which I parked on the property under the ponderosa pines. It became my base of operations. I cooked on a camp stove. I washed in the stream, the water cold enough to make me gasp, clean enough to drink. I slept with the windows open and the sound of the water running over stones as my only lullaby. I spent my days clearing a space for the cabin's foundation, following Harlan's blueprints to the letter. His drawings were so detailed, so precise that they functioned as a conversation. Every measurement was a sentence. Every notation was a piece of advice. In the margins, he had written small notes in pencil. Use pressure treated for the sill plate. The ground here stays wet in spring. Double up the headers over the windows. Snow load will be significant. He had visited this land. He had walked it. He had studied its soil and its drainage and its exposure to the wind. He had designed this cabin not as an abstraction, but as a response to this specific piece of earth, the way a poem is a response to a specific feeling. I felled trees with a chainsaw. I milled them into rough lumber with a portable sawmill that I bought from a man 2 towns over who was closing his operation. The work was brutal. The chainsaw vibrated through my arms until my hands went numb. The sawmill required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance. One mistake and a board was ruined. One lapse in concentration and a finger was gone. But I loved it. Every swing of the axe, every bead of sweat that fell from my face onto the fresh-cut wood felt like an act of defiance. A raised fist against every force that had ever tried to diminish me. The foster system, the war, the streets, the loneliness, the lie. I wasn't just building a house, I was building a home. I was rebuilding myself board by board, joint by joint, the way Harlan had rebuilt himself in exile, the way he had rebuilt the porches and the roofs and the shelves of Pine Hollow. One careful, deliberate act at a time. The constant hum of anxiety that had been my companion for 5 years, the low-grade electrical buzz in my chest that never stopped, that made sleep a negotiation, and peace an impossibility, began to fade. Not all at once, not like a switch being flipped, more like a tide going out so slowly that you don't notice it's happening until you realize you're standing on dry sand. It was replaced by something else, the satisfying ache of tired muscles at the end of the day, the quiet pride of a wall that stood plumb and true, the deep, almost sacred silence of the forest at dawn when the only sounds were the stream and the birds and the slow creak of the pines as they leaned into the morning sun. Tanner came by on weekends. He'd show up in his aunt's pickup truck at 7 in the morning, ready to work, asking questions about joinery and load-bearing walls and the difference between a mortise and a tenon. I taught him what Harlan had taught me, which wasn't much in terms of hours, but was everything in terms of foundation. Get it low, let it kiss the water, don't punch it. The same philosophy applied to wood as to stones, gentle, patient, precise. Nadine brought food. Not every day, but often enough that I started to expect the sound of her car on the dirt road, the crunch of gravel under her tires, the sight of her walking through the trees with a covered dish in her hands, and a look on her face that dared me to refuse it. Fried chicken, cornbread, a casserole that she called whatever was left over, but that was clearly made from scratch, with care, with intention. Vernon came by too. He didn't bring food, he brought knowledge. He'd walk the site with me, studying the blueprints, pointing out things I'd missed, suggesting adjustments based on decades of experience building in this climate. He brought tools that I needed but couldn't afford, lending them with a gruffness that barely concealed the generosity underneath. Just bring it back when you're done, and don't break it. The foundation was poured on a cool October morning, the concrete mixer rumbling and churning, while Tanner and I worked the forms with shovels and rakes and our bare hands when the tools weren't enough. We were covered in gray slurry by noon, our arms aching, our faces streaked with cement dust. But when we stepped back and looked at what we'd done at the flat-level, solid rectangle of concrete, sitting in the clearing between the pines, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long that I almost didn't recognize it. Pride. Not the sharp, defensive pride of a soldier, not the bitter pride of a man who refuses help because he's been refused help too many times, a simpler kind. The pride of a man who has done good work with his own hands, who can point to a thing in the world and say honestly and without qualification, I did that. The first walls went up in November, raw pine framing the wood still smelling of swape and forest, the grain running in long, clean lines from floor to ceiling. I followed Harlan's blueprints exactly measuring twice, cutting once the way he would have done. The way he taught me without knowing he was teaching me all those years ago in his workshop when I was too young to understand that what I was watching was not just a man building things, but a man showing his grandson how to live. The framing went up faster than I expected. The wood was true, the joints were tight, and with every nail I drove, I could feel Harlan's presence not as a ghost, but as a guide. His blueprints were his voice, clear and steady, and certain, telling me where to place each stud, how to brace each corner, when to stop and check my work before moving on. By the end of November, the walls were up and the roof trusses were in place. I stood on the subfloor one evening and looked out through the framed window openings at the forest. The trees were bare now, their branches dark against the sky that was turning the deep, cold blue of early winter. The stream was still running, its voice quieter now, hushed by the cold. It was small, it was unfinished. There were no windows yet, no doors, no insulation, no siding. The wind blew straight through the framing, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney somewhere down the valley. But it was mine. It was real. It was standing on ground that Harlan had bought for me, built from plans that Harlan had drawn for me with tools that Harlan had maintained for me, funded by money that Harlan had earned for me. Every board in the structure was a letter he had sent finally delivered. Every nail was a word he had spoken finally heard. I found the motorcycle under a tarp one afternoon and spent 3 days tinkering with it. The Triumph was a machine of beautiful simplicity, its engine a puzzle that Harlan had already half solved by his careful storage preparation. New battery, fresh fuel, clean the carburetor, replace the spark plugs, adjust the timing. On the third day, I kicked the starter, and the engine caught coughing once, twice, then settling into a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the frame and up through my legs and into my chest. I rode it that evening, down the dirt road onto the two-lane highway through the outskirts of Pine Hollow and out into the countryside beyond. The wind hit my face like cold water. The road unwound before me in long, sweeping curves that followed the contours of the hills. The engine hummed beneath me, steady and strong, a machine that had been asleep for years and was now awake, alive, moving through the world with a purpose that matched my own. It wasn't an escape. Not this time. Every road I had taken before had been a road away from something. Away from the foster homes, away from the war, away from the cities and the shelters and the parking lots where I slept with one eye open. Every road had been a retreat, a withdrawal, a tactical surrender. This road was different. This road led back, back to the land, back to the cabin, back to the life that was taking shape slowly and imperfectly in a clearing in the pines. This wasn't running. This was the opposite of running. This was the thing you run toward when you finally stop running away. A homecoming. I rode until the sun went down and the first stars appeared cold and bright and impossibly numerous in the dark country sky. Then I turned the Triumph around and rode home. Home. A word I had never used without quotation marks, without irony, without the quiet internal disclaimer that it didn't really apply to me. But it applied now. The camper trailer under the pines, the workbench with its tools, the half-built cabin with its open walls and its view of the forest. Home. That night I sat by a small fire outside the camper. The flames crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkness. The stream murmured in the background. An owl called from somewhere deep in the trees, a low, solemn note that hung in the air like a question. I took out the last letter, the one that began, "My dearest Silas," the one that ended, "Now go build your home." I read it one more time slowly, letting each word settle into me, the way rain settles into soil. And when I reached the end, I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in its envelope. I put the envelope in the breast pocket of my jacket over my heart, where it had ridden since the day Miss Pemberton slid it across her desk. My grandfather was right. The best revenge is not to destroy what your enemy has built. It is to build what he can never take away. They took my parents, they took my grandfather's place in our family. They took 20 years of birthdays and holidays and Saturday mornings in the workshop. They took the sound of his voice telling me to get the stone low to let it kiss the water. But they could not take this. They could not take the smell of sawdust in the morning air. They could not take the feeling of a solid floor under my feet built with my own hands on land that a quiet, stubborn, heartbroken old man had bought with 20 years of penance. They could not take the sound of the stream or the sight of the stars or the warmth of the fire or the knowledge finally irrevocably permanently settled into my bones that I was loved, that I had always been loved, that the man who disappeared had never really left. He had just been standing in the shadows holding his breath, watching me grow, writing letters he could never send saving money he could never spend on himself, drawing blueprints for a home he would never see. He had given me everything, and the only thing he had asked for in return was that I live. I looked up at the sky. The stars were thick and bright, scattered across the darkness, like sparks from a fire that would never go out. The silence was so deep and so complete that it didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence, like the forest and the stream and the sky were all holding me in the palm of their hand. I closed my eyes. I breathed in the cold, clean air, pine needles and wood smoke and the faint lingering ghost of sawdust. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need to be anywhere else. I didn't need to run or hide or plan my next move or brace myself for the next blow. The hum was gone. The anxiety was gone. The dislocation, the sense of being a stranger in my own life was gone. I was home. And somewhere I was sure of it, an old man with rough hands and a rumbling laugh was finally at peace, not because the world had given him justice, not because the men who had taken everything from him had been punished, but because his grandson was sitting by a fire on land he had bought with love beside a cabin he had designed with hope, reading a letter he had written with the last of his strength, because the seed had grown, because the house was rising, because Silas Calhoun, homeless veteran, abandoned grandson, forgotten soldier, was building a life, not out of anger, not out of vengeance, out of the only material that lasts. Not out of vengeance, out of. And if you are listening to this, if you have made it this far, then I want you to know something. The story of my life is not about what was taken from me. Not anymore. It is about what I have decided to build. And if you have a story like that, a story about finding something worth building in the wreckage of something that was destroyed, then you are not alone. You were never alone. Now go build your home.